In the previous lecture, while talking about the front end and the back end, I mentioned simple and static and dynamic websites or applications a couple of times, but without really defining what they are. So in this video, I wanted to clarify these things and also talk about APIs in order to bring all these concepts into the bigger picture of back-end web development in general. So let's start by talking about static versus dynamic websites. So a static website, or a simple website as I called it in the last video, is when a developer uploads the final ready-to-be-served files of a website onto the web server. These files usually contain HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, and more. And as I said, these are the exact files that the server will later send to the browser when the website is requested. The browser will then take these files and render them as they are. This means that there is no work done on the server, there is no backend code, and there's also no application whatsoever running. Okay? So it's just a static web server serving static files, exactly like I mentioned in the last video. Now you might think, wait, when there is JavaScript on the page, then there are usually dynamic effects, like animations and stuff, right? Well, that dynamic that you mean there is a different dynamic. It's just in the context of front-end development. In the broader context, dynamic has nothing to do with effects on the page or things moving around, but with the way websites are generated on servers. Okay? So dynamic websites are different from static websites because they are usually built on the server each time a new request comes in. So like we saw in the last video, dynamic websites usually contain a database. Then there's also an application running, like a Node.js app, which fetches data from the database and then together with a predefined template, builds each page that the user requests dynamically based on data coming from the database. So each time a browser requests a page, that page is then built as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, which will then be sent back to the browser. This whole process is sometimes called server-side rendering. So again, that's why it's called dynamic, because the website can change all the time according to the content that's in the database or users' actions on the site. For example, if you're logged into Twitter, it will show you a completely different page than when you logged out, right? And it will also show you a different page tomorrow than it did today, because there are new tweets, so new data in the database. And that is what dynamic websites are all about. Now, if you, for example, go to jonas.io, and you should, by the way, then you will always see the same content, the same website, no matter when you visit or what you do there. And so that means that it's a static page. All right? Does this difference make sense? Now, sometimes we use the term dynamic websites and sometimes the term web application, but they are kind of the same thing. Usually when people refer to web applications, they mean a dynamic website with some functionality like logging in, creating user profiles, searching for stuff, and things like that in general. Websites are, for example, something like a WordPress blog. They are still generated dynamically, but we can't really do anything but reading them, right? And traditionally, static and dynamic websites were the only two types of websites. But in recent years, thanks to how powerful browsers have become on the client side, we see more and more websites that are basically based on APIs. So let's learn how these work and how we can use Node.js to power them. Let's just keep the dynamic websites here in this slide so that we can better compare the two. So just like with the dynamic websites, we have a database here and we have an app that fetches data from the database each time a client makes a request. So in that sense, a API-powered website is actually quite similar to a dynamic website. So both work dynamically. Now, the big difference here is that with an API, we only send the data to the browser, usually in the JSON data format, and not the entire website. So again, just the data is sent to the client and not the ready-to-be-displayed website. So no HTML, no CSS, only the JSON data, alright? So when building API-powered websites, there is always these two steps. Building an API and then consuming the API on the client side. And by the way, API stands for Application Programming Interface. And on a very high level, it's basically a piece of software that can be used by another piece of software to basically allow applications to talk to each other. And we will talk a bit more deeply about what an API actually is once we start building one. Anyway, now about the client side I just mentioned. So this is where the website is then actually assembled by plugging the data that we receive into some sort of templates, usually using some fancy front-end framework like React, Angular, or Vue. I'm not going to go into specifics here because that would be for a front-end course, but in very general terms, this is how it works. So you see that when building an API-powered website, the building phase of the website kind of moved from the backend to the front end, right? Or we can also say it moved from the server to the client. That's why many times you will see dynamic websites being called server-side rendered because they're actually built on the server. On the other hand, API-powered websites are often called client-side rendered, which makes sense, right? So for us backend developers, it's actually far easier to just build an API and let the front-end people build a site, right? And in fact, Node is an absolutely perfect tool for building APIs, and it's very commonly used for that. But of course, it's also perfectly suitable to build a dynamic server-side rendered website. So in this course, we will actually do both versions, starting with the API, and by the end of the course, also building a rendered website using the exact same data. I chose to do both because I believe it's extremely important for you to know how to build both an API and a server-side rendered website. And now just to finish this video, I wanted to quickly mention that the APIs that we build with Node, or really any other language, can of course be consumed by other clients than just the browser, which is a huge advantage of building an API instead of a server-side rendered website. So let's say we build an example API on jonas.io/API/myCourseData. So whenever we hit that URL, the server will send back data about the web development courses that I am currently teaching. Now, so far, we only talked about requests coming from web browsers, but we could also request and then consume the exact same JSON data on a native iOS app, or an Android app, or even on desktop apps for the Mac or for Windows computers. The possibilities are really endless when we build an API, because we simply have one data source which can then be requested and used anywhere, not just browsers. That's kind of the problem when we build a normal dynamic website. We return HTML and CSS and JavaScript files, and only browsers can really understand these. So we're then trapped into that single platform. And that might not be a problem in many cases, but for complex products that require a lot of apps and websites and web apps, usually an API is always needed. So in this example on jonas.io, I could build this API and then build an API-powered website and some apps and get my data on all these clients from just one source. All right? And some people or teams don't even have any client of their own at all and simply sell access to their API to third parties who will then consume these APIs and not their own. So there are really entire businesses built around this philosophy of just selling an API to other developers or companies. Anyway, I hope that with this final slide, the concept and reason and kind of philosophy behind building APIs now became crystal clear to you. So let's now move on.